It wasn't always like this. I used to believe one day they'd see me. When I was 10, I spent 3 days building a desk in the garage from broken table legs and warped plywood. I scavenged from the curb. I stained it with coffee grounds and sealed it with clear nail polish. I left it in the hallway, placed it like an offering. Hopeful. My father walked past it on the way to the laundry room and muttered, "Whose trash is this?" That's the moment I learned applause wasn't coming. Growing up, I wasn't the misunderstood genius or the quiet prodigy. I was just invisible. Not in some poetic way in the actual practical sense. People forgot to pick me up from school. Teachers called me Aubrey's sister for years. At family barbecues, I was asked to take the group photo, never in it. Aubrey was magnetic. She had dimples that could get her out of anything, the kind of smile that made strangers offer her free ice cream. She won spelling bees, sang at holiday shows, mastered piano by 12. Her trophies had their own shelf. Mine were boxed in the garage. Once I got second place at a regional coding competition. She got a balloon bouquet for making the cheer squad. I didn't resent her. Not at first. I just thought maybe if I worked harder, they'd notice. While she was rehearsing her solo for the winter pageant, I was curled up on the floor learning Python from an old O'Reilly book I checked out with my own allowance. I didn't need cheers. I needed silent structure. I loved the hum of old desktop fans, the rhythmic click of mechanical keyboards. I built my first script at 13 to automate the school's cafeteria feedback form. No one knew, but it worked. Still in our house, if it couldn't be photographed or bragged about at church, it didn't count. Once my mother asked me to log off and help with something real. I had just completed a UX overhaul for a small civic tech nonprofit. She told people I was good with Pinterest. By college, it got worse. Aubrey went into marketing, sleek, visible, branded. She had intern swag bags and tropical photos captioned "grind." I took consulting jobs, worked odd hours, signed NDAs. When I landed a strategy gig that helped pivot a failing wellness app into a $1 million acquisition, I couldn't even tell them. My mother introduced me that Thanksgiving as between jobs, I think. I had just negotiated a licensing agreement that netted my client over $2.2 million. I smiled and passed the mashed potatoes. But these were just the early scars. What really changed me were the paper cuts, the everyday omissions that whispered, "You don't matter." Aubrey once told mutual friends I was doing something with blogs or Etsy or whatever. At her birthday dinner, she tagged every guest on Instagram except me. When I confronted her once gently, she shrugged. It's not that deep, but it was. It was the depth of knowing I had become a placeholder in my own story, someone to round out a table fill space in a photo, maybe run errands but never receive credit. I stopped correcting people. There's a kind of tired that makes silence feel like protection. So when her wedding invitation came, I accepted quietly. I picked the dress she requested, muted gray high neckline, no sparkle. I RSVP'd early, didn't ask for a +1. I even offered to help with setup. She replied, "You don't need to stress. Just come and enjoy." The day arrived cloudless and curated. Every moment was a scene from a magazine. Aubrey glided like chiffon royalty, her smile the centerpiece. I slipped into my seat without fuss near the DJ booth, where the bass made conversation impossible. My place card was misspelled Sabina. I chuckled, moved it aside. It wasn't even the worst misspelling they'd used. As the ceremony ended and the reception began, I watched her hold court with relatives who forgot I existed. One uncle asked if I still lived in that little studio downtown. I had bought a condo 2 years earlier, cash. But I smiled, because what was the point? They had already chosen their version of me, the one they could box, name, and ignore. But that version was a ghost, and I had quietly buried her years ago. The reception was already humming. Light clinking of glasses, laughter bubbling over past hors d'oeuvres, that specific glow that weddings carry when the ceremony is over and the real party begins. I sat at table 19, not quite in the corner, but close enough that the only conversation I could hear clearly was from the speakers blaring a Bruno Mars song on loop. My table mates were Aubrey's co-workers and someone's old college roommate. Nobody made eye contact. No one asked who I was. Every so often, someone would hand me an empty glass, assuming I'd take it back to the bar. I did, out of habit, like muscle memory from a life spent cleaning up after other people's messes. Then he arrived. Cale Donnelly. Even if I hadn't recognized his face from a dozen business write-ups I would have known, his presence was immediate. He walked like gravity owed him something. Perfectly cut navy suit, no tie, a tousle of hair that probably cost more to style than my whole dress. People turned toward him like sunflowers chasing warmth. My mother spotted him first. She lit up like a candle, waved both arms like she was directing air traffic. Cale. Over here he smiled, polished, knowing, and headed straight for our table. My father rose so fast his chair screeched. Uncle Paul straightened his jacket. Even Cameron the groom stepped aside like he knew who the real star was. Cale shook hands, laughed at a joke, leaned in to compliment my mother's dress. Smooth, precise. Then he turned to Aubrey. "You look stunning," he said, eyes locked on hers. She did. That wasn't the problem. She had that bridal radiance like the world was arranged just for her. Then it happened. Cale lifted his champagne flute, tilted it toward her, and said, "Impressive crowd, Aubrey." I was standing less than 3 feet away. He didn't blink in my direction, didn't hesitate, didn't even have the basic awkward courtesy of a nod. His gaze passed through me like I was part of the centerpiece, decorative but irrelevant. To him, I wasn't a person. I was air. And something shifted. I didn't flinch. I'd trained for this. Years of family dinners where I was introduced as an afterthought. Birthdays forgotten. Conversations rerouted around me like I was a piece of furniture. I had survived bigger insults than a cold shoulder from a tech CEO. But that smirk, that casual dismissal, that sentence impressive crowd, it wasn't about me personally. That was the point. I wasn't even a consideration, just an assumption that if I were standing there, it must be to refill someone's glass or adjust a napkin. And still, I could have let it go. I could have smiled, sat down, eaten my overpriced plate of grilled chicken and risotto, and disappeared again into the background like always. But something clicked. Not rage, not sadness, just resolve. The kind that forms like steel beneath the surface. Not loud, not flammable, just final. Because here's what Cale Donnelly didn't know: I had written the report that killed his company's last funding round. Not directly, not with my name on the slide deck, but my analysis, deep data-backed, ruthless, was the reason Carradine Capital passed on investing in his Series B. I had flagged their customer churn, their over-reliance on a gamification model that bled users once the novelty wore off. I noted their legal stumbles during their Latin America rollout, the UX bugs in their onboarding funnel, the dip in retention during Q3. I wrote it all in a memo at 3 a.m., caffeine-fueled with citations, charts, and comparative benchmarks. It had been shared across 5 partners. They passed. And he never knew. Because men like Cale don't read footnotes. They only notice what shakes the table, not who's under it, propping the whole thing up. Until now. I stared at him, at the man who had cut through the room like a blade, so confident, so untouchable. And I thought, one sentence. That's all it takes. Not to humiliate, not to destroy, but to reclaim the space I'd been denied for years, not just by him, by all of them. My family, my sister, every person who had mistaken my quiet for absence. I turned my glass slowly, the condensation cool beneath my fingertips. My pulse was steady, but I could feel the old adrenaline crawl in the familiar tingle before a big client meeting or a tough negotiation. Precision, timing, control. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need revenge. I just needed the right moment. One sentence dropped like a scalpel, measured, sharp, clean. Because sometimes the loudest sound in a room is the one that breaks the story everyone thought they knew. I stood up, not abruptly, not with any grand gesture or clinking of glass, just a quiet, fluid rise like standing to stretch after a long meal. At first, no one noticed. The music had picked up and a few guests had migrated to the dance floor. My aunt was telling Cale about Aubrey's old college awards. My mother was adding how she had always been a natural leader. I walked toward him. No announcement, no theatrics, just movement calculated, grounded, inevitable. Cale was mid-sentence when I stopped beside him about a foot away. He didn't turn right away, probably assumed I was staff. Then I spoke, calm, even, unshaken. Just so you know, I said your Series B valuation's gonna drop if your platform keeps bleeding retention like this. That's it. One sentence. Like flipping a switch in a dark room. He blinked. Actually blinked. For a man like Cale, who probably hadn't been surprised in a boardroom in years, it was a microsecond of visible disorientation. His champagne tilted slightly. A single drop slid down the side and hit the floor. He turned fully toward me. A beat of silence. Then Aubrey? Who is this? My sister's smile faltered. That's my sister, Sabrina. The way she said it stumbling, confused like discovering a hidden drawer in a dresser she thought she'd memorized. Cale looked at me again. This time not like furniture, like a glitch in his matrix. Sabrina Hollis. I gave him a small nod. That's right. His eyes searched mine and I saw it. Recognition. Slow, dawning, undeniable. Not because we'd ever met, but because somewhere in his mental archives, he was matching dots he hadn't even realized were connected. He started. I smiled. We've never met officially, but your board has seen my comments, or at least the ones I filtered for Carradine. There it was. The shift. Not anger. Not defensiveness. Just awareness, sharp and undeniable. A man used to scanning rooms and categorizing people had just discovered he'd overlooked the only name that mattered. You work with Carradine Capital, he asked. Not a question, more like a memory clawing its way to the surface. Among others, I said voice neutral, that others carried weight. Carradine wasn't just another venture firm. It was one of the quiet kingmakers in tech, rarely public, always precise. The kind of firm that could make or break a startup in a single memo. I'd been consulting with them as a strategic advisor for nearly 5 years. Not full-time, not loudly, but consistently, deeply, and always with influence. I was the person founders never met, but whose notes shaped acquisition decisions and funding gates. Aubrey looked between us like we were speaking a different language. Wait, what's happening? She asked. Cale didn't answer. He was too busy running mental calculations, matching language from past reports, remembering the report his board cited, the one that stalled their expansion timeline. I remember your review, he said finally. It was direct. And accurate, I replied softly. He nodded. Yeah, it was. The silence that followed was charged. At nearby tables, people had started to hover, pretending to sip drinks, clearly eavesdropping. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Aubrey's jaw had tightened, her bridal glow dimmed by confusion, maybe even something like fear. You never told me you worked in tech, she hissed. Like, seriously worked. You never asked, I replied. Not bitter, just factual. She didn't argue because she knew it was true. Aubrey had spent so many years trimming me down to a version that made sense to her that she'd stopped listening before I had anything worth saying. Behind us, a groomsman who had ignored me earlier glanced over with sudden interest. Guests were shifting, whispering. Even my mother across the room had gone stiff with attention. She was watching now, watching like she had just heard a name she didn't realize carried weight. And Cale, he was quiet, alert. Like a man rereading a book he thought he knew. I wasn't aware they had... I didn't realize you didn't, I said gently. Most don't. That was enough. I didn't gloat. Didn't twist the moment into a lecture. I simply stepped back and let the silence do the rest. Because sometimes the loudest statement is the absence of explanation. Let them catch up. Cale looked recalibrated. Not humbled, not embarrassed, just very, very aware. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a card. "May I?" he asked. I nodded. He handed it to me. "I'd appreciate a follow-up," he said. Sincere. Focused. "I'll think about it," I replied. And then I returned to my table, Sabina, according to the place card, but not invisible. Not anymore. The air felt different. Charged. Shifted. Like something tectonic had moved. Quietly. Permanently. I didn't sit right away, not because I was basking in anything, just because the weight of what had just shifted needed a moment to settle. I could feel it, the ripple. Before I was the person people passed by without comment, the one they asked to take photos, not be in them. Now the ripple was subtle, but unmistakable. A waiter paused as he cleared plates and gave me an extra second of eye contact. One of the groomsmen, Derek, I think the one who had earlier complimented Aubrey's marketing team like it was the Vatican, passed my table, slowed, and offered a quick nod. "Heard what you said to Kale," he muttered like it was a password. "Didn't know you were in the business." In a way, I replied. He nodded like he understood, but he didn't. Most of them wouldn't, and I wasn't going to waste time explaining. Let them sit with the ambiguity. Let them wonder. Two of my cousins approached next. Rachel and Amanda. They had once posted a meme in our family group chat calling freelancing code for unemployed. Now their voices were syrupy with curiosity. "You never mentioned you work in venture capital," Amanda said. I didn't correct her. Let them believe what they wanted. Titles don't matter, leverage does. Even Aunt Denise, who once pulled me aside and offered to help me apply for a real job, slid next to me near the dessert table, with a look that hovered between regret and calculation. "You've always been so private," she said as if it were a compliment. I gave her a soft smile. That's all right. I wasn't asking to be realized, but I knew who was watching most closely. My mother. Across the room, behind a cluster of centerpieces and well-groomed family pride, she stared. Her expression was tight eyebrows, drawn lips, thin posture, rigid. Not angry, just recalibrating. She didn't come over. That's not how my mother operates. She doesn't do apologies. She does positioning. She whispered something to Aunt Trudy, who nodded while sneaking glances my way. I knew that posture, chin tilted slightly, eyes calculating. Sabrina had become useful. That was the only kind of interesting she respected. Let her watch. The music thudded in the background, something upbeat and ironically titled "Good Vibes Only." People were dancing now. Aubrey's college friends held their heels in one hand and drinks in the other, laughing like they were still 21. I watched them twirl under chandeliers, knowing full well they'd remember none of this tomorrow. But the others, the ones who heard what I said to Kale, they'd remember that. The moment someone they overlooked took up space with one sentence, Aubrey was the last to move. She lingered near the bar for a while, probably reviewing the situation like a campaign manager post-debate. Her back was straight, her shoulders tense. Every smile looked practiced, now pulled tight across clenched teeth. Eventually, she approached. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, just a drift like she happened to be walking in my direction and simply didn't change course. "Can we talk?" she asked. I glanced at her. Her makeup was still perfect, but the corners of her mouth had stiffened. Her voice carried that same brittle note it always did when she felt things slipping just beyond her control. We stepped out onto the balcony. Twinkling lights were strung along the railings. The air was cooler out there, soft with the scent of roses and frost. It reminded me of high school, sneaking out to the porch with mugs of cocoa after family dinners got too loud. For a second, we were kids again. Then she spoke. "You made a scene." I didn't flinch. I spoke one sentence. "In front of my boss." "In front of mine," I replied. She crossed her arms. "You humiliated me." "No," I said. "I reminded him I exist." "That's not the same thing." Her mouth opened, then closed. She hated when I didn't rise to the bait. "You should have told me what you do," she said finally. "That you're whatever that is." "I tried," I said, "years ago. You weren't interested. That's not fair. It's honest." She looked away, biting the inside of her cheek. Mom's already acting like she knew all along. She's going to tell people she supported you from the beginning. She always rewrites the story I said. But you had the real version. You just didn't want to believe it. Silence stretched between us. That silence between sisters is thick, heavier than anger. It's where all the unsaid things sit lined up like ghosts. Finally, she asked, "Why didn't you ever fight for space? You let us treat you like background, and now you want center stage." I turned to her. "I don't want center stage," I said. "I never did, but I won't apologize for not being small enough to ignore anymore." Her mouth opened, then closed again. That old reflex to defend, dismiss, diminish just barely contained. And then, softer, more tentative than I expected, she asked, "Are you happy, Sabrina?" The question caught me off guard. I took a breath. "I'm at peace," I said. "I built a life I don't have to explain to anyone. That's more than happiness. That's freedom." She nodded slowly. It wasn't an apology, but maybe it was the closest she could get. We stood there a moment longer beneath strings of light as the sounds of clinking glasses and laughter floated through the door behind us. The wedding was still spinning on, but something inside it had changed. Not just for me, for all of them. When we walked back in, the cake had been cut. Guests were gathered around the dance floor, humming through familiar songs, slightly tipsy and unbothered. Aubrey slipped seamlessly back into her role host bride golden girl. But now something was different. She smiled tighter, laughed shorter. I recognized the tension in her jaw, not panic, not shame, just the discomfort of realizing you weren't the only headline in the room anymore. I didn't need to reclaim the spotlight. I just needed them to stop pretending I didn't exist. As I made my way toward my seat, still labeled Sabina, I caught Cale's eye from across the hall. This time, he didn't look through me. He looked at me. He raised his glass. Not the kind of toast you give when you're networking or trying to impress. This one was different. A nod, a gesture of respect, recognition, even caution. I didn't return it. Not out of spite. Just no need. That part was done. At my table, I picked up the final sip of champagne flat now and let it sit on my tongue. It tasted the same, but it felt different, because everything had shifted. I stayed for another 20 minutes, long enough to not make it a scene, just long enough for people to notice the space I took up and the silence I kept. The cousin who used to call me the weird one asked for my LinkedIn. The aunt who once offered to help me apply for admin jobs tried to pitch me her friend's startup idea. And my mother. She stayed on the opposite end of the room watching, always watching. It was her eyes I felt the most narrowed, calculating, whispering to Aunt Trudy, nodding toward me with tight-lipped curiosity. That's how my mother says sorry. She doesn't apologize. She reclassifies. Once you become useful, you become interesting. She'd rewrite the history in a heartbeat, say she always knew I was gifted, that she encouraged me in her own way, that she always saw something special in me. Let her. That version would keep her comfortable. She needed that more than I needed an apology. The truth didn't require her permission. Later, as the dance floor filled and the bouquet was tossed, I stepped outside, called for a car. The air was cooler now, crisp in a way that cleared your head. I reached into my purse and pulled out the wedding invitation. Heavy cardstock, Aubrey and Cameron in gold foil, ivory envelope. It was beautiful, curated, expected. But I didn't belong to that world. Not really, and that was okay. Because the real power wasn't in crashing the party. It was reminding them I'd been on the guest list all along, that I'd simply chosen to wait until the right moment to speak. I stood at the curb letting the headlights of arriving Ubers blur against the night. I thought about all the years I let them write my narrative, all the times I nodded, smiled, allowed myself to be described in polite euphemisms between jobs, doing things online, figuring it out. And I let them. Because when you're taught not to take up space, you start to believe the best thing you can do is disappear politely. But something changes when you realize your silence was never proof of absence. It was preservation until the moment mattered. That night at my sister's wedding, I didn't crash a narrative. I rewrote it with one sentence, measured, calm, surgical, not a speech, not a declaration, just a shift, one that would echo. Cale would remember, so would Aubrey. So would every guest who heard me and the ones who didn't but felt the silence after. The family that had once ignored me wouldn't suddenly embrace me. That wasn't the point. I didn't need praise. I wasn't auditioning for inclusion. I had already built the thing they thought I was missing, a life. And not just any life. One built on my own metrics, my own pace. Behind closed doors, under NDA, outside of hashtags and holiday letters, but real, solid, independent. The kind of life that didn't need to be validated by photo albums or party seating. The kind of life that only needed one moment, one sentence to alter a room. I didn't carry their doubt home with me. I left it there on table 19 next to the crumpled Sabina card and an empty flute. What I carried instead was weightless, freedom, precision, proof. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel erased. I didn't feel unseen. I just felt enough. I didn't keep the business card. I left it in the pocket of the dress I would never wear again. Not because I didn't want the connection, but because that card didn't represent power anymore. I did. In the days after the wedding, nothing dramatic happened. No family calls begging forgiveness. No viral LinkedIn posts. Just silence. Which was fine. Because silence had always been my space, only now it was mine on purpose. I returned home to the life I'd built in layers, quiet, solid, intentional. No framed diplomas or brag walls, just clean code, whiteboards full of possibilities, and a bank account that made its own kind of statement. But something had shifted permanently, not in them, but in me. There's a difference between being unseen and being underestimated. The former wounds you. The latter can be a gift, because when no one's watching, you can build without performance. You can think without posturing, and when the moment comes, you can strike precisely. That's what the wedding was, a controlled ignition. The years of dismissal paper cuts quiet insults. They were never the end of me. They were friction, fuel. And I carried that fuel into every midnight memo, every deal I guided, every pivot I advised from the shadows, until I no longer needed anyone's permission to take up space. Aubrey didn't text me after the wedding. She didn't follow up with an apology or even a thank you. She just let the silence speak. And maybe that's what we needed. Not forced reconciliation, not a photo op moment of sisterhood, just a new truth between us, an understanding she could never undo. She'd seen what I carried, what I'd become, and she knew it didn't come from her approval. My mother didn't call either, but I saw the ripple. Aunt Trudy mentioned me differently at the next family event. Sabrina, who works with venture groups, as if it had always been common knowledge. Cousin Amanda started liking my old posts. I even got a message from a high school friend asking if I was the same Sabrina Hollis from the wedding. Yes, but not the one they remember. The real version, the one I had always been becoming, was finally visible. Not because they saw me, but because I no longer needed to be seen by them to exist fully. Recognition doesn't have to be loud to be final. Sometimes it's a glance across a room that lingers. Sometimes it's a name remembered in a meeting where you're not present. Sometimes it's a single sentence that echoes longer than applause. I didn't speak to Cale again, but I know he remembered. And the next time a woman in a quiet dress sits near the edge of the room at a wedding or gala or pitch dinner, I bet he looks twice, just in case. As for me, I didn't chase the energy of that moment. I didn't try to replicate the mic drop, because the power wasn't in the shock. It was in the clarity. For the first time in a long time, I stopped shrinking myself for other people's comfort. I stopped dimming the lights so Aubrey could glow brighter. I stopped editing myself to be digestible. I just existed, fully, freely. And that more than anything was the real transformation. Because when you stop trying to be what others need you to be and simply become what you are, everything around you adjusts. Even the people who never thought they'd have to. So no, I didn't keep the business card, but I kept the memory of a room that shifted, of a glass that trembled, of a name remembered, and of a woman who finally knew that she didn't have to raise her voice to raise the bar. Have you ever been erased by the people who were supposed to know you best, treated like background noise in your own story? Sometimes it only takes one moment, one sentence to remind them who you are. If you've lived something like this, share your story in the comments. And if you're still waiting for your moment, it's coming. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for the next story. You're not invisible here.